My name is Heather Strang.
My name is Lawrence Sherman, and this is Chapter 7, the Cambridge Crime Harm Index.
So, Larry, what exactly is the Cambridge Crime Harm Index?
I'm so glad you asked. It's a tool for comparing and ranking potential targets for policing that have different kinds of crimes, one that allows the police to emphasize the seriousness of the crimes, not just the number of the crimes.
So why is a crime harm index important for evidence-based policing?
Well, it's an essential tool for all three of the T's, targeting, testing, and tracking, but especially targeting, because it allows you to do things like comparing two offenders. One of them has 100 convictions, the other one has 10 convictions. Now, you might think the one with 100 convictions is a more serious target. But suppose in that 100 convictions, it's all breaking into cars and stealing things of not great value, no violent crimes at all, compared to the one with 10 convictions, who has been in prison for an attempted murder, for a robbery, been charged with rape. How can you rank all of them in all of these differences if you had a group of 50,000 offenders whose criminal records you're trying to analyze? 50,000 cases, you can't make a decision one at a time. You need to have a standard quantitative way of saying this person's record is more serious than this person's record. This person has caused more harm to the community than this person. And it's not just about the number of times they've been convicted.
But don't most governments just issue a list of crime counts and not worry about crime types?
That's true. That's what they do. But they shouldn't do it because crime types are not created equal. Sentencing policies reflect that some crimes are much more serious than others. But nobody adds up all of the days of potential sentencing for all of these crimes that are reported. They just add up the crimes as if they were all created equal. And there's many more shopliftings than murders. And if murder doubles and shoplifting drops in half, then the overall crime count goes down despite a doubling of murder. That doesn't make any sense at all. And that's the way most governments are dealing with this issue right now. We need to do better.
So how do crime counts get represented in terms of seriousness in the way that we usually hear about crime?
If you take an example here in England and Wales, in a recent year, there were 308,000 shoplifting crimes and 551 murders. Now, if you divide the shopliftings by the number of murders, what you get is 560 times more weight in determining the total crime count from shoplifting than you're giving to murder. So the role of murder becomes trivial in the overwhelming volume of these very low seriousness crimes, but only because crimes are being counted as if they were created equal when they're not equal in harm.
So we shouldn't even really talk about a crime rate.
That's right. It's so misleading to talk about the crime rate. It's like the disease rate, as if you had 3 common colds last year and I had 2, our combined disease rate is 5 colds for 2 people or 2.5 diseases in this household per person. We don't count crime that way. We don't count disease that way, so why should we count crime that way? For example, if you had 2 pneumonias and I had 5 colds, would that be equivalent kinds of diseases? You could die from pneumonia, but nobody's going to die from a common cold. And it's the failure to make that distinction in the crime count that we have to get around and stop talking about the crime rate. If we want to talk about the crime something, we could talk about the crime index.
So how else can we talk about all crime taken together?
This idea of an index, especially a harm index, is very similar to what economists always talk about in the cost of living index. Now, when they say the cost of living goes up, so people's pensions go up, or it somehow changes the tax rates, what they're doing is looking at the percent of a household budget that is allocated to certain kinds of costs like housing. So what proportion of your household budget goes to pay for your housing, to pay for your transportation, to pay for your food, to pay for your clothing. And so the change in the cost of any one of those things is adjusted by what percentage of the household cost is associated with that item, like clothing. So if clothing goes up, it's not going to have nearly the effect on the household budget as housing going up. Cost of housing is the largest portion of any household budget, and that's the way this index is calculated. So it's not just an average of the average cost of these different pieces of a budget or of a crime problem. It's a weighted average in which you adjust for how big an issue any one of these elements is. So just like the parts of a household budget, we have the parts of the crime problem. It's very simple to do it once you accept that approach.
So how exactly does this work as an index for all crime types?
Well, I understand that a lot of people in policing don't particularly like numbers. Maybe that's why we go into government service, because we're numerophobic rather than numerophiliac. We don't love numbers, but let me give you some numbers. If the sentencing guideline for murder in England is 3,650 days in prison, and for robbery it's 800 days, but for shoplifting it's 1 day, and we have 100 crimes, if they're all shoplifting, the crime harm index is 100. That's 100 days for those 100 crimes. Now, if you change to just 3 different crime types out of that 100, so there's 1 murder and 2 robberies, you've now added to the 97 days of prison for the shoplifting, you've added another 5,000 plus days to the total. So rather than having the 100 days imprisonment equal to the shoplifting crime, you're now getting 5,347. In other words, a crime harm index would give you 53 times higher weight once you adjust for the kind of crime you're getting, whereas a crime count will say, no, it's all 100, whether it's got 50 murders in there or none. It's all 100 crimes. And that's what you get with the cost of living index. That's what you can get with the crime harm index. So that's our milestone, number 13. Because all crime is not of equal seriousness, crimes of different types should be multiplied by the standard length of imprisonment for each type of crime and then summed into a crime harm index.
And has any country adopted this idea?
Well, I published it first in 2007. Canada, I think without reading what I published, adopted what they call the Crime Severity Index in 2009. But I don't think they're calculating it reliably, because rather than using a sentencing guideline or a statute, something that remains fixed, they're looking at how judges are actually sentencing. And as we know, judges are responsive to news media pressure and public concerns. So what we could be measuring in Canada is judicial sensitivity as much as a change in the seriousness of crime. I think we need a constant currency, and that's why I recommend using sentencing guidelines where you have it, as in many U.S. states, as we do in the United Kingdom, or in a place like Uruguay, which has actually started to use this recommendation in some of their evidence-based policing. They're just taking the statutory range of, say, 2 to 5 years, so they take the midpoint of the range. And so for every crime that has a 2 to 5 year sentence, they just take whatever it is, 3.5 years, halfway between 2 and 5 year sentence, and they multiply that by the number of crimes that had that sentencing range, and that's how they're calculating the crime harm index in Uruguay. One way or another, you can do this in any country, any state you're in. You just have to decide it makes more sense to do something than to stick with this ridiculous treatment of every crime type as if it's created equal.
So what are the benefits for evidence-based policing of using a crime harm index?
It can be applied to track the trends in crime, to compare areas, and most importantly, to allocate resources. It can be applied to compare offenders, or victims, or places, or gangs, or criminal networks, or even people who recruit into criminal networks. It can be used to target, to test, and to track.
But are there some crimes that ought not to be included in the crime harm index?
Yes, there's a lot of crimes that get counted that really aren't generated by a victim telling the police that they've suffered a crime. Instead, they're generated by the police going out and looking for somebody carrying a joint of marijuana in their pocket. And the number of crimes of that kind you count depends on how many police you send out. So again, it's not a measure of public safety, it's a measure of policing, and it doesn't belong in something that's supposed to be a measure of public safety. So the crime harm index has to keep out anything that the police generate through their own initiative, or even that the private sector generates, like catching shoplifters. So if the economy is getting worse, people are coming into retail stores and they aren't getting caught because the store laid off its store detectives, then the shoplifting count would go down. Makes it look like the crime's going down because the economy has gotten worse, when it's just a complete fiction that the shoplifting crime is reflecting how much theft there really is in society. We need to leave out any report that's not citizen initiated.
So there are ways of crime reporting that would be included in the crime harm index. You've mentioned citizen initiated reports. What else?
I think that's it. I think you wouldn't take organizationally initiated activity from private companies. You wouldn't take police initiated reports. Anything that is reflecting of investments in trying to catch criminals shouldn't be part of the estimate of how much crime there is. We've got problems like computer crime, fraud committed against banks. A lot of these things are being left out of the equation, and they need to be brought in. But for the time being, I'd be happy to start with just those things that people call the police up about, and the police take a report from a victim. If we stick with a victim crime harm index, we'll have a lot more truthful and transparent data about whether crime is getting more or less serious.
So that's because available resources can affect proactive reporting.
Exactly. We shouldn't be confusing the police resources invested or the private security resources invested in counting the amount of crime harm that the population is suffering as what we can learn from the population itself telling us. And you can have another category for reporting that, but the crime harm index should be focusing on what the victims tell the police.
So do you think the crime harm index is the best bottom line for crime?
Yeah, we talk about the crime rate because everybody wants to have a bottom line, like the gross domestic product. You want some big number. And the best number then is not a sum, but an index, which you could measure in terms of the number of days imprisonment prescribed by sentencing guidelines for every crime that's reported if they were all detected and punished, which they won't be, but by applying this rule consistently, we can tell whether the seriousness of crime is going up or down.
So can you tell us again how to calculate crime harm index?
Sure. Okay. Number one, give each crime type a harm level with the source like a sentencing guideline or a statute, number of days imprisonment. Secondly, multiply those days of imprisonment or that harm level by the number of crimes having that level of punishment. And then when you multiply it out, you add it up. You add up all the weights for all the types, and the index is simply the sum of all of the crimes times all of the harm levels for those crimes, and that gives you the harm weight. So for example, in 2002 and 3, in the United Kingdom or England and Wales, there were 5 million crimes, which if you multiply them by their sentencing guidelines, gives you 148 million days in prison, or the equivalent of 400,000 person years in prison. If, in theory, there was one offender per crime, every offender was caught, convicted, and sentenced, and the sentences were served. None of which is true, but it is a standard and reliable way to measure whether the seriousness of crime is going up or down. So I've got some pie charts here that show you how little violent crime matters in the crime count pie chart for that year. And if we go to the next graph, you see what the crime harm index does. And most of the pie chart in the crime harm index is now violent crimes like rape, robbery, grievous bodily harm with intent. Whereas if you go back to the preceding bar graph, pie chart, you see the crime counts, and there's very little presence of violent crimes in there. So these pie charts, I think, show us why it's so much more important to use the index rather than the crime count.
Okay, so one more time, how do you use the crime harm index?
Well, you target your units in terms of how much crime harm they have, rather than just the crime counts. You can test your programs, not just in terms of the count of crime that they prevent, but in terms of the harm level of crime, measured by days imprisonment. And none of our experiments in policing, hotspots or repeat offender projects, none of those have been computed in terms of harm. We should probably go back and recompute all of our findings from all of the previous 100 police experiments to see what difference they made in terms of harm. And some of those that didn't look like they were effective might have been very effective, but they just were counting the wrong thing. So finally, you can track police activity, like how much investigative time is put into high harm crimes versus low harm crimes. We can do so much more that is important in counting what matters when we count the harm of crimes and not just the number of crimes.
So we're going to see the crime harm index again as we roll on downstream?
I think even as we speak, the crime harm index is rolling downstream all by itself with a fine band of dedicated supporters of evidence-based policing. And they don't have to fuel this steamboat anymore than just to tell people about the idea, because a lot of people say, yeah, that's right, we should do it that way. And that's a real measure of how much more professional policing can become very quickly.
Rolling, rolling.